Hey guys, this is Valde from Moji here. Danish Counter-Strike is one hell of a drug, but so is Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of the Know-It-Alls of Counter-Strike. And I have a feeling, quite frankly, every episode... Listen, this is one of the most well-branded shows I've ever done. But if every episode, I think, lives up to the billing, I think this one might set a new record here, Tommy. Because the problem is, we're going to... Oh my God, how dare we do it? It's like mentioning Voldemort in the Harry Potter universe. I had to reference the one fucking book these kids have read, right? We're going to dare to talk about the premise of a European Super League. A la what was going to happen in association football or soccer, as Americans call it in the latter case. So obviously the problem with this story, I think it's a very interesting story. In fact, interestingly enough, in League of Legends, he didn't know anything was going to happen in football because no one did. But Monty actually had a similar concept where he thought this would be like a different way in League of Legends that you could make like a Super League and it could draw all this world attention. Because his premise was in esports, well, we haven't monetized fucking almost anything. We just get money from sponsors for like, raw eyeballs. His premise was that's the way you scale the eyeballs even more, isn't it? That's how you get all the eyeballs in the world. You basically see how far you can push the boat out, and then, at that point in time, sorry, we can't worry about all the grassroots leagues. Well, let's see if we can make one league work first, guys, and monetize that, and then we'll fix the rest. But the problem is, I noticed when it happened with this Soccer European Super League, he tried to engage with this discussion, and I don't think almost anyone, even in esports, was willing to have this discussion. It's like everyone was so like emotionally tied into it, or they were even doing things that, it tied into the idea their dad watched some team like 30 years ago. Like they were bringing all sorts of weird things in. I didn't see actually almost any discussion about the real, like the premise even, or how it could be executed, or what, by the way, God forbid there could ever be any upside, And in fact, if people saw, because of the bad backlash, basically all the English clubs pulled out the next day or something mental, and then basically the idea as far as you can tell is like dead in the water. So let's start at the beginning. I will say at the beginning, obviously I don't work with them anymore. Do still have that stock though, so why not? Fuck it. But lurppis said some capacity works with B-Site, which is the company that owns Flashpoint, and Flashpoint essentially is... It's not a European Super League, is it? If it was, I might still be there. But it's the similar premise. It's the idea that a bunch of teams will say, in theory, we're good businessmen and some of the others aren't. So let's make our league. Let's be selective as to who can join it. And let's hopefully, pool resources, fan bases, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's what Flashpoint wanted to be. It just was unable to become to this point in time. So where's your entry point to this? Like, first of all, like, were you anyone, like, I know Finland's not, like, huge on football or soccer. Like, were you someone who actually particularly cares about football? Do you have any basis in it?
I used to watch quite a bit of soccer when I was younger. I honestly haven't almost at all in the last 5 to 10 years. I'll watch the big games, the World Cups, some of the Champions League finals, etc. But like, I don't follow it day to day. I don't care about it as much. I'm more in the camp of many of the American sports as I think you are. I think so my interest in the Super League story is much more on the just sort of like the business side of it, and why I said it's actually kind of similar to what the premise behind Flashpoint was, which is how we've kind of got around to this episode. I just think from a product perspective, if what you want to watch is the best football, you want the best players to be competing in a smaller number of teams playing against one another all the time because you like the sport, so you want to watch the best do it as much as possible. I just think the product that almost certainly would have been the end outcome of the Super League would have been far superior to status quo. I think if you're currently playing, all these different national leagues which have their own subdivisions, and you're splitting viewership, you're splitting sponsorship revenue, et cetera, all these different things across a million different teams from different towns. I just think the outcome is that you effectively end up subsidizing many of the lower level teams, who I'm sure would still be able to function without it, given how much fan interest there is just from like local residents, et cetera, but like probably would see an impact on their budgets. But you would end up with more talent density at the very top, which is what I think all of us would want. At least I would want in any sport that I would watch. I think the NBA would be a better product if we slash the teams in half, and instead of a 30-team league, we'd have, say, 16, and all the best players would just play on 16 teams. I think the product would be better. And
I can actually address that directly, dude.
Same premise.
A lot of people won't know this because when they present stats they love in sports, sadly, to remove the context because they want to show you that, like, oh, Russell Westbrook must be the best player ever, some garbage like that, right? So what a lot of people might not know is one of the things that's very underrated about the players from the 1960s is that the 1960s began and the NBA had 8 teams in it at the time. And by the end of the 60s, it was only up to something like 14 in the entire thing. It was like 7 in each division. Now, what that meant was exactly what you're talking about. It means that when you look at the numbers of someone like Wilt Chamberlain or some monster player like that, he's not just like putting up those numbers. He's doing it against like, the 7 other best players at his position effectively in the world. Like, obviously they import players, but essentially like he doesn't have a game off. So actually, in some ways, like that, some of those players are actually underrated because essentially there are no filler spots on their teams. There are no filler teams in the league, and assuming you've actually like put the funnel correctly of high school to college to the pros, you're going to have an insanely talent-rich league, and that's why actually a lot of those players, there's a reason why a lot of them are in Hall of Fame and stuff like that. It's like essentially there was no filler back then. There was no scenario like I see a lot right now in the NBA where there are people who put together bonkers numbers, sometimes just because their team's so bad. It's like they can just take every shot.
Yeah, you take 30 shots a game, you can be a below average player in every metric and still average more than 20 points.
Yes. So, like, basically, like, again, obviously, that was when like was literal like constraints of the league, etc. But I think the premise has validity to it. Now, even the argument that you would make, which is the best argument for an open system, of like, well, the open system because it's like essentially a kind of meritocracy. It's not quite, but it has elements of it. Essentially, the good thing about an open system is it can sort of error correct, like. And your team Ents would be an obvious example, right? Ents wouldn't have been in a franchise league, but we now know if they hadn't have been in 2019, we'd have thought there was a shit team winning DreamHacks, but actually they were like the second or third best team in the world. So listen, there's going to be a notable cases where good people are going to get it wrong. My problem with that is that's like an example of the specifics, like an anecdotal case. It's not actually an argument against the system. What you're actually essentially saying there is if the GMs don't do a very good job in the real teams, they won't have the best players. Like, well, the solution there is obvious, isn't it? Let's get better GMs. Like, so explain in a bit more detail what you mean by that. Like, you think it would be a better product in that sense? Because obviously that was exactly the concern people had against the European Super League. They thought, like, what about the domestic leagues? And, it's cool when we just meet in the Champions League. Like, people had their own arguments against it. So why do you think it would be a better product?
Maybe the best way to put it is if you just think about some of the Counter-Strike tournaments that we have, given that's the context for the show, is I actually think a lot of the time you'll end up with a better tournament if you do, let's just say, a 12 or an 8-team tournament with all the best teams there, rather than a 24-team major. And the reason for that is, over the course of hundreds of games at a major or hundreds of maps, there's going to be a bunch of upsets. And what'll happen is some of the sort of at least longer term performance-wise weaker teams will advance further, and they're going to effectively ruin some of the matchups, and you're not going to get the best games in the playoffs. And, you can say that the other teams earned it, and that's, at that specific time, that's what happened. At the same time, you find somebody who actually will tell you that they really enjoyed the playoffs at the Faceit Major, and I'll show you somebody who didn't watch the event. Because that's what happened at that tournament, and there was just was just no good playoff games at that event, and that's not Faceit's fault. It's not the tournament's fault. It's just how the results ended up playing. And if instead you would have had, let's just say, the 8 best teams, I just think the quality of the play would have been better. You have the best teams. Now you can't control whether they all peak at the right time, whether they're all at their peak performance at that given time. But I think it reduces the chances of things going wrong leading up to it. To the extent, well, you basically spoke through the talent density issue of just, you have fewer weaker teams. I think like currently the biggest problem with Counter-Strike, besides just the COVID and everything being played online, is that this is really the last couple of years, I think, have been the first time the contracts have actually been enforced to an extent where people can't just leave. So there's
you can't force your hand like Stu did leaving Cloud9, for example.
Yeah. So as a result, talent's actually split across like a crazy number of teams. Like you look at like what should be the best CIS roster? I don't know, but it's not Navi and it's not Gambit. It's not either one of those. It should be some combination of them and maybe others. Yes. And that's the case for many of the other teams. But the problem is that players are locked into contracts that are very valuable, that are hard to get out of. So what instead of having, let's just say, 10 super good teams or 5 elite teams and then 5 sort of challenger teams, which is made up numbers, but like roughly how the scene has.
That was kind of the distribution for about 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah. what we now have instead is there's probably a couple of teams that are a little bit above everybody else, and then there's like 15 teams who might just beat each other on any given day. And I don't think many of those teams actually want to have those rosters very specifically. I think there's a lot of cases where the players, if they had the opportunity to start from scratch, would create completely different teams, and the level of play would be better. But instead, we're kind of stuck in this situation. And if the number of teams were constrained, not only would those teams actually be able to monetize better and therefore pay players more, and in effect spend more money acquiring players and making sure that the best players are on teams, but also you just wouldn't be locking players the same way to the other teams, because the players would not want to be outside of the league. So they would kind of try to force their hands to get into the best league the same way everybody wants to be in the NBA or everybody wants to play in the NHL. So from my perspective, I think what you end up with is just a lot of less interesting games. I understand from our many conversations over the years, particularly as it comes to some of the senior executives at the ESL with whom we've argued some of these points many times over the last decade plus. Many people watch sports because they like variance, they like the upsets, they like that they don't know what's going to happen. I'll root for the underdog here and there. At the same time, if the underdog wins this game, I might not even watch the next game because it just might not be interesting to me. So to the extent that I could just have all the best teams playing at all times, I'd rather just do that. I don't have any need of, but never once in my life, I'm just have HLTV open on my second screen. Never once in my life have I thought that I'm like dying to watch Heroic play. Just hasn't happened. I've never thought that I'm just dying to watch Force play. It's just not a thing. If I can get more Navis, Furious, Astralis, G2s, those are the teams that I, really enjoy watching play. And none of those, by the way, I don't think have the exact rosters that they would want to have either. It's just that they've made it work regardless of that.
I mean, one thing I will say, because I know a lot of people, one of the problems I've noticed when you try to argue against like a system that exists, especially if it's a tenured one. So in this case, like the idea that like a major could have, all kinds of level of team could qualify for it. I mean, in theory, I've always thought this is the maddest detail ever. The open qualifier, absolutely. In theory, like me and you can make a team and probably enter that. Like that's real. Hence why cheaters have played in the same qualifiers as famously like Nip was failing to make it out of, etc. Like there've been some really ridiculous examples, which to me, like that is a million miles from sports. Like imagine if Federer every time he was going to qualify to a Grand Slam had to play against any guy from across the block. Like that would be even a ludicrous premise to bring up. So one aspect that I actually think is very underrated is because I've noticed what people do is because they need to believe some kind of coping mechanism because they love the underdog story you're talking about. Basically, there's no cost for an underdog story that a casual fan will not pay. He will sacrifice the entire bracket, the final. He will sacrifice great players' careers. He just needs the thrill of that one underdog making it. Listen, we could go psychological angle. Maybe I could do it. Maybe it could be me. You could have some fucked up angle like that. I think another factor is, like sometimes if they're casual fans, you hear them say it like, I'm bored of seeing the top teams play. So they're kind of like, it's kind of like a fuck the system vote, And then the problem is they always reverse engineer the idea of like, but whoever won the match must have deserved it. Therefore, like, if the bigger team loses, like they weren't good enough, they couldn't adapt, they throw all these terms out there. One of the reasons why I think that is absolute bobkiss, in my opinion, is because most of the tournaments we play in Counter-Strike, you don't know who you're going to play at the tournament beyond match one, or I'm in a round robin group, which we tend to try and move away from now. So you don't really know your opponents. And often, especially if it's a Swiss system or something, you're finding out like, maybe 12 hours before you play them. Now, I'll tell you right now something that I'm sure would blow a lot of MMA fans' minds, but I've watched MMA long enough, I can tell you it's the case. If an MMA champion, pick anyone you want, pick like an undefeated one, like Khabib Nurmagomedov, right? If he had to fight on 12 hours notice, just random fighters from around the world, dude, he'd lose sometimes. I'm telling you right now, because he couldn't game plan for them, he couldn't specifically strategize for them, he wouldn't know like what their strengths are. There'd be a random guy who, by the way, never could be a champion. He could never do what Khabib did, but he could maybe beat Khabib in that scenario. And that's what we do to the top teams in Counter-Strike. Yeah, and the reason why I bring this up, right, because again, if fans are going to go, so what? Because by the way, they're kind of on Valve's side. Like Valve, if you haven't noticed, is sort of like players are God, fuck everyone who's not a player. Like that's why players can play God with the rosters. I tried to bring this up years ago on lurppis. Like it never happened, but those God sent players didn't understand the power they had when they went from Fnatic to God sent, and then when Crims was going back, and if you remember, it was gonna decide who had the major legend slot. If they'd have actually understood and they'd have been from certain other countries, mate, they could have had those two orgs over a barrel in like an insane bidding war, because essentially it was the difference between playing in the minor, where no one knows if you get out, or just being in the major in like the top 16. And that is worth so much back then. That used to literally like be it for these orgs. So the reason I bring this up, right, is I don't go totally player side. I mean, after dealing with players over the last year or so, mate, they're just as much scumbags as the orgs. They're just not as good at business. That's why they cry. As usual, the loser in the fight's the one who wants to change the rules. So here's the angle I wanted to bring up, right? When you have a scenario like that, would it be good for MMA if the best champion, an undefeated champion, could just lose randomly? And it wrecked his whole streak. It wrecked all the storylines that were built up. It maybe pointlessly put another person into the mix of the championship fights who would then just lose the belt immediately, disappear off into nothing, regress to the mean. Now, the reason why I bring that up is that would be terrible for the sport of prize fighting. It would ruin all the story. There's a reason why, by the way, in boxing, it's not just because they're cynical, that they feed like people cans so they become like the right matchups and they get the matchup you want at the right time. Because if you don't make that exact money fight, you make like a tenth as much with the guy who beats him, And they know that the reason I'm bringing this up is the one thing Counter-Strike doesn't have is the money. We don't have the monetization. If we can't take care of that, Counter-Strike as it exists, one day it might not exist. Or it might be one of those like tier 2 or tier 3 esports, a small thing. Maybe it'll be, right now it's looking like it might just be European only, might just be a cool shit that me and you watch because we are old heads, but all these casual fans will leave. They'll go watch whatever the fuck. Maybe it'll be Valorant, maybe it'll be the next game, who knows. Like business-wise, this is the angle that right now, I'm not saying it's a solution, but it's potentially a solution, right?
Yeah, fully agree. And I think one thing that I didn't mention that I think many fans view differently, and I fully recognize the irony in this coming out of my mouth, given that I actually work for an organization that operates many different teams in many different games. But I don't root for teams. I root for players, and that's the case across every sport that I watch. I used to like watching the Cavs when LeBron was there. He left, and I haven't watched the Cavs since. I didn't watch a lot of Lakers when they were bad. I watch Lakers now because LeBron's there, AD's there, etc. And I think that's part of the reason why people are hesitant to think about the structure in those terms that we laid out before, which is, to me, if you have the best players, the most valuable brands will end up being a part of it, or the most valuable brands over time will be created as having been part of it, because that's where the best players are. But ultimately, the players are whom you're watching, not the tag, even if that adds to the experience. And I think for a lot of people, that's part of the disconnect. I solely think about this in terms of, how am I going to get the best players there? And that doesn't mean the current rosters. It just means the best players. It's much less important to me whether Bit or Perfecto is in that league than whether Simple is there. I care a lot less whether Junior is in that league than if Yuri is there, for example. So I think that's another wrinkle to the whole point, which is sort of, I guess, like definition of the product in terms of the best players together playing in best teams over time, rather than whichever happen to be the best combination of those players at any given time, given all the constraints that are put forth around team construction.
Right, as I alluded to before, one of the reasons I have myself so often argued in favour of an open system, I did it to the League of Legends owners when they were trying to lock it down, they became franchise. I told them, like, the problem is, like I said before, I can't trust some of you guys to be the right GMs. Like, I know, sadly, as they did do if anyone watches the LCS, you will just keep a guy who has a big name and be the 8th best team and just think, well, whatever, I can still market him, I can still kind of like, I can't be relegated. Meanwhile, there might be some guy, obviously League of Legends, the example would be, maybe he has a bad personality and so people are like, he's toxic, and then you just won't recruit him to the league, and he has no way to force his way through the door, basically. Whereas, like, actually what used to make, for example, the European LCS amazing was the amount of times that like a tenured team was like relegated and then some nobodies came up and actually were amazing. It was ridiculous, mate. Some of them would go to Worlds the same year they got promoted. So back then, again, that was just about bad GMs. Like, the obvious thing that people will say, and this is an obvious argument against this type of a league, both the European Super League in soccer and this type of a Counter-Strike league or esports league is if all these big orgs go together and they pool their resources and their players and they try to make basically like they're going to be the capstone of the pyramid of competition, the fear people obviously have is what happens to the rest of the leagues? Does that just lose all does no one care anymore? What would you say against that?
Well, I mean, and there's two ways to think about it. One, I do not think that the Counter-Strike ecosystem as currently constructed can support what exists, i.e. I think there's too many tournaments, too many leagues, too many teams funding high player salaries, more so than Counter-Strike itself can support. Now, there's two ways to solve for that. One is to change the structure so that it actually can be supported. And the other is just waiting for the markets to sort themselves out. And I think we're already starting to see that to some extent, because like you said, Counter-Strike is currently just turning into a European esport. There's really nothing Counter-Strike in North America currently. I suppose Liquid spending some of the time here, but even they've been forced to spend most of the year in Europe. If the economics don't make sense over a long enough time horizon, it's gonna get changed one way or the other. I suppose the other piece of that is, that lower level leagues, they will adapt. They're gonna have to be a little bit different if Navi doesn't play a DreamHack Open every now and then, if Furia doesn't play a DreamHack Open every now and then DreamHack Open will adapt. It's not going to be the same cost structure as it were when it could attract the higher viewership. Some of those will disappear realistically, or would disappear in that scenario. And I think that actually would be better off for everybody. I'm pretty firmly of the view that I would end up watching more if there were less. So put another way, if there's a lot of tournaments going on all the time, assuming one isn't, the type like Katowice or Cologne, which clearly is just like a level above the others or a major, you can kind of excuse yourself for missing some of the bigger games, if they're like an inconvenient time, particularly for California, or you just have something else planned. On the other hand, if it happens a couple times a year, you make time. So, like I'll have my TV on for the NBA games or during the season, the NFL games, basically every day when there's games on TV, but there's very few regular season games that I'll make time for. There's like specific matchups that are very interesting that I'll want to watch and see what the implications are for the playoffs. And then you get to playoffs, you get deeper into the playoffs, there's going to be so few games that you start actively making time for it. So whereas I think a lot of the time what you hear from people is like, well, the industry runs on viewed hours, which is true. That is the most important metric. I believe that if you concentrated the content to be of higher quality in fewer hours, you'd actually get higher viewership. And I think that would make up for a bunch of it. I think the fact that you can kind of dilute and oversaturate the market, dilute the viewership experience by oversaturating the market, I think is actually a net negative. Now, like there would be losers, just as there would be winners, but you can't have it all. It's you can't just do everything just for the sake of doing it if it doesn't make sense. And at some point, you're going to have to right size the structure a little bit, unless you just grow into the structure as currently existing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of points there. Like one, it's just a nice thought exercise, but I think if people actually engage with it in good faith, they'll get the point I'm making, which is the same fan that doesn't want this lurppis precisely because they want the underdog stories. They want anyone to have a chance, right? In theory, right? They loved, if they really are true to what they said, they loved a Vanguard's run at the major, right? Now, listen, the Vanguard was better now when the Virtus Pro only got Yikinda, blah, blah, blah. But that team back then, that was a mad, lucky performance. Like, here's what's weird, right? Here's how you know they don't love that performance. They only love that if you're upsetting vitality. If you're upsetting big, if you upset the bit, here's the mad thing about what they don't explain. There has to be Goliath before their David story has any legs to it. And the reason why that has to be the case is they weren't watching a Vanguard when I saw them lose to Furia in some like small tournament 2 months before the major in a best of 5 or what. They didn't give a fuck. They don't watch DreamHack Opens when they're not online and we don't have to talk.
By the way,
if they did, there wouldn't be a problem.
They also didn't necessarily care about the grand final, if I recall correctly. And a lot of the time, I think I made the point, I think you have made the point recently in some of these online tournaments run by ESL that like ESL has just gotten wrecked by the grand final matchups. because of upsets in semifinals
Sure.
and quarterfinals, and that have a pretty big impact on viewership. So people might enjoy the way the result and like the excitement of a bigger team losing, getting upset makes them feel at that time. But again, it has implications on future games and what happens later, and then they're not tuning in for the following game, regardless of what they say about being interested in the other team, etc.
And then the other thing I thought we'd get into a little bit as a tangent, because it's a good one, right? One of the main mistakes I made for the sake of my own sanity, right, was trying to learn a little bit from people who know a lot more than me about the economics of the industry. Like, basically, I wanted to know, like, I thought of it as like, put it this way, I had a relative who was a plumber. I was thinking of it like a plumbing system. Like, what are the inputs? What changes? What controls this aspect? It's kind of machine-like when you understand some of the elements, right? Sadly, the reason I say I almost ruined my sanity is because learning even a little bit, when I would then turn around and try and explain it to other people, I just was encountering people who have no concept of how the economic side works. They just say words, like they say terms like salary or like, but they don't know what it means. They don't know what the economic, what are the pressure points? What are the triggers? What are the mechanisms at play here, right? So what I wanted to address was, when you say that, right, it's basically the same thing Cloud9 said when we made Flashpoint. It's that the salaries are way too high to justify based on what you get back from the tournament organizer, like an ESL, etc., the revenues. Therefore, like in the long run, you are just bleeding money. You survive with VC money, and until this has changed, it's just a race to the bottom. You're all going to race and be bankrupt, or like you have to increase the revenues. Now, what everyone said then was, they go, well, that's rich, isn't it? Cloud9 and the other orgs that pumped the salaries up, now you complain. I really genuinely want to turn around and say, what do you think a salary market is? Because I've got an analogy for them that might make sense for a second, right? First of all, let's just hypothetically, because a lot of idiots won't even be able to get past this, but if you can, it's good. Hypothetically imagine that a lot of people in MMA use performance-enhancing drugs. Maybe they just use different ones than or they have the latest ones, or maybe there's even people using old school anabolic steroids. I don't know if I imagine they're a lot smarter nowadays. It's probably more like the EPO level of like Lance Armstrong. I'm probably thinking they're like smart, etc. But basically, think about it logically, right? If all the people in your weight class in the UFC take steroids of some type, performance-enhancing drugs, and it helps them get faster, stronger, like recover quicker, more endurance, if they get all those benefits, right, you can choose not to. You could be the guy that they're suggesting is the guy, just don't pay more salary. You could be that guy, right? But I imagine in the thought exercise, a lot of people could understand your chances of being the champion are going to be very low because you're in an arms race and you're choosing not to buy arms. Like, you're going to lose the war. So when people say that about salaries, I really wonder what the fuck they mean, because there's no salary cap in Counter-Strike. So did they want, right, Cloud9 to say, right, well, I pay my players, let's say years and years ago, $10,000 a month, and now a bunch of other orgs, maybe Immortals when they came in with no Winston, maybe FaZe Clan, I'm picking the obvious ones, Optic, maybe these orgs came in, and the way they got their players initially was they said, I'll pay you $15,000. Right, apparently, lurppis, they want Cloud9 to go, sorry, that would be unsustainable, so we're going to stay at 10,000. And they actually genuinely think you could just keep operating your team, keep all the same players, you can beat those teams, and magically you can just not... Like, what I don't think they seem to understand is, as long as you're in Counter-Strike, we're all going to get dragged along by the people who inflate the market. There's no way to stop it, as far as I can tell.
So put another way, what people don't understand, it's a pretty, the Econ 101 lesson is... the prices are set by the marginal buyer. It doesn't matter what 100 other people think. If there's one person who's willing to pay more, that's the price. That's how prices are set. It doesn't matter what 100 people think is the fair price, so long as there is one person or group or team or whomever who's willing to pay more, they are going to be setting the price.
Oh, I'll give you a great example.
Because the other side will want to make more money.
Here's a fun one for you. So obviously the most famous comic book in the world is Action Comics #1 that featured the first ever appearance of Superman. It's the most expensive comic book ever, right? It's the one where he's lifting a car on the cover. And I don't know what it would be, but I'm going to guess it probably costs 6 figures now if you want like the mint condition one of that. Basically the example you're giving here, right, is a fan going, but I want to buy that comic. So why has someone inflated that to $100,000? It's like, because someone was willing to pay $100,000. Yeah, but it's not worth that. It's just an old comic from like, yeah, we know that. But the problem is he bought it. So if you want it, you're going to have to come with your 100,000. No, but I think it should only be worth 10,000. Listen, we can have that conversation. By the way, if you haven't noticed in life, the word that ruined a generation was should. Should is like, we just enter your fantasy land now. Listen, I'd love to live there. I have to live in this reality though,
I mean, the other thing is like, given that it's an open circuit, and if you think about, there's a bunch of organizations that have been around for a very long time. You think,
sure.
like G2 now, you think Navi, you think MIBR, like many of these organizations have long histories, Fnatic, for example, NIP. On the other hand, let's just say that you are somebody who wants to start a team. Here are the ways for you to get into like a tier 1 respected esports. You can pay tens of millions to get into the big franchise leagues for, the Activision properties or League of Legends. That's not accessible to most people. You'd have to be very wealthy or raise a lot of money. And, if you're just starting something, it's going to be very hard for you to do that. And by the way, the game publishers may not let you in, even if you have the cash, depending on who you are and who your backers are, etc. On the other hand, you could enter an ecosystem such as Counter-Strike, which is open and has no restrictions. No, first of all, you're not paying any buy-in just to build a Counter-Strike team the way you do in League of Legends or Call of Duty or Overwatch. And on top of that, you still have to pay for the players in those leagues too. So now all of a sudden, it's very clear. If you need to get into esports, you're building a team, you probably want to get into Counter-Strike. It's the easiest, has a massive fan base, there's lots of tournaments. You don't have to be the actual very best to become notable and get to play big tournaments and be relevant and have a chance to build a brand around that. It's the most accessible one. At the same time, again, all it takes is one person to set the price. Now, if we go back, because this is the know-it-alls, we go back all the way to the 1.6 days, there is one team, Core, that was one of the all-time greats, has arguably the best 1.6 player of all time on their roster. And it was like a famous joke. People always said they just can't, they just get so unlucky every single time. They played for 8,000 different organizations. It wasn't like Karn, who played for Fnatic his entire career. It wasn't like some of these other guys who just stuck to one roster the entire time or one tag. They would play for probably between 5 to 10 different tags, sometimes again reverting back and forth. And people always ascribed it to just bad luck and said, we just get unlucky. The reality is that, as you and I both know, and some of the other who were involved in the industry at the time know, they got a bunch of offers from the tier 1 orgs. They could have joined some of the other very well-known 1.6 orgs and played for them their entire careers. The difference is,
I think by the way, I'll confirm that. I think at the end of my time in SK, we were trying to sign them.
Yeah. So again, they had that opportunity, but there was an incremental buyer who was setting the prices, who would offer a couple €100 more a month, which was like the equivalent of a couple thousand more a month now. And they would always sign for them because they had the most money. Now, the problem was when that didn't work out, they ascribed it to bad luck, as far as I could tell. And that's why they always changed and went to a new place. And instead of going for the SK or trying to go for the Fnatic, they went for Vitriol.
Someone you never heard of. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes it works out that way, but they beat up the prices nonetheless. Now, in today's market, many of the organizations have raised pretty significant funding from private investors, whether it's family offices, other types of investors, sports teams, strategics, etc. And therefore, you don't necessarily have an option to just not be in a game. I mean, some of us have more flexibility than others, and it depends a little bit on the communicative strategy, but it'd be pretty hard for us to say that we're just not going to have a Counter-Strike team for MIBR, given where the brand is.
Yes.
Therefore, you need to have a brand. Now, we were actually put in this position effectively twice last year. Our company, which is, we've seen now that there were no higher bids, contrary to what was communicated publicly, I think, at the time. But we were effectively given a price and told this is the price that it's going to take. And I think everybody on the other side of the table just figured we can't say no, and our only chance is to say this is what we're doing, and that's how it's going to go. And there's no way around it. Only we decided that that's not an acceptable outcome for us. But not everybody. I don't know that it's. By the way, I think everybody lost in this scenario in the short term.
That's why it was said. Yeah.
I think in the long term, we made the move that's going to have short term pain but be helpful in the long term. But I think everybody lost in the short term, especially the fans. But that's what happens. And to go back to the earlier point is, if I'm starting a new organization tomorrow, I'm raising money from investors I know, I'm starting an organization, I'm coming into Counter-Strike, I'm going to find out who the best players are who are running out of their contracts in the next 6 months. I'm going to go to all of them, and I'm going to offer 5K or 10K more a month. So why can I pay more? because I don't have a choice. I either don't have a business at all or I overpay. If I overpay, it might still work out. That's the incentive structure. I'm not saying I would do it or recommend doing it, but I can understand why somebody would do it. If their own entire business is, I'm going to build a successful Counter-Strike team, it might be better to overpay, even if that gives you some baggage that's hard to get rid of later on, if the other outcome is, or other option rather, is that you don't have a team in the first place. So it's very obvious to see why the market in an open circuit, it's structured in a way that's always going to end up in the same scenario.
I'll give another reason as well to switch tracks a second as to why like a Super League approach potentially could be massively successful. Because I'll come from my world, the world of narrative story building, right? I know in theory they could already do this in the LCS, in LEC, and I can tell you they don't really, right? Occasionally LEC or something like that puts out like a small featurette, like 5 minutes long, or they do a hyped teaser for the season and people lose their minds. So you know this content would be very popular. If I have a league where I have, say, 8 teams and they're the 8 best teams in the world, and I know here's when we play during the year, and I know here are the weeks we play. Basically, I have all the variables. I mean, literally me, I would create the narrative content that would make the exact same match 10 times more appealing to a casual fan. Casual fan might watch anyway if they like the teams and they're the best teams. But I'll tell you what, if I had the teams from last year, let's take the top 8 teams last year, right? If I have lurppis, Vitality, and I have Na'Vi, just the featurettes I'm going to make about Simple versus Ziwu, I'm going to make that like Lionel Messi versus Ronaldo. I'm going to blow that storyline up to a degree. I bet it could even get mainstream attention, mate. If I have the proper talking heads in it and all this, that is going to make that match that they play. Listen, I'd watch them play anyway, but there's going to be a guy who maybe he's just not a fan of either. He's going to tune in for this because of the storyline we're going to create. We're going to hook people in. In my opinion, this again, it's kind of how you can limit test like where the monetization is right now, because until we maxed out the other variables, you can't always just say, oh, it's just people not doing the right business deal and stuff. Well, we can't know that, can we? Like, there's other areas that are still untested to some degree, and you know the industry does advance, so people are making better deals over time. You know, if you haven't noticed, half the thing that we're battling here is people just looking at a problem for 5 minutes and then summarily just dismissing it with a very simple reason, like, oh, just pay less money or just do better deals and get broadcast rights. So, again, there's another word. Should and just are the 2 words that ruined an entire generation, because they always put just before some insane feat, and they always say should for something that doesn't exist. So there's the code word. I've cracked it for everyone. There's the Enigma code for the retards, basically. What do you think? Because I know people are going to say, why didn't you do it at Flashpoint? Mate, I tried my best. I didn't have any of those players, did I? I couldn't make the Bobski versus fucking, I don't know, Esperanto matchup. That wasn't as hyper a feature if I did it as, the Ziwu versus Simple one, was it? Come on.
And by the way, I think this we never got to realize because we ended up shortening the season because of COVID, and we never had the LAN
every
finals,
time.
But
we never had as long a project as we initially planned. Yeah.
But one of the things that we were planning on doing, I don't remember if this was announced ever, is the first finals were supposed to be at the Globen in Stockholm.
Yes, we were going to pause after the bracket, and then we would go locate to a stadium, and it would have even, I think it would have been like a week or something. There would have been like a lag, right?
Yeah, and there were also going to be days off. So not only would there not be 2 games the same day, it would have been, say, semifinal on a Tuesday, the second semifinal on a Wednesday, no games on Thursday, and then the grand final on Saturday, because that gives you 2 days to actually create content, which is the way it works in the real world. I mean, I watch games because I go on ESPN and I see there's a new feature on somebody. Like there was a feature on JJ Redick, I think earlier this week, maybe last week, and that made me, I don't know that decided that I was going to watch the Mavs game, but it made me a little bit more likely. And that's how it should work. But when you don't have any visibility as to who's even going to play and when, it's just not possible to plan content the same way. And ultimately, that should be at least one of the hooks that gets people to watch, gets people interested. But the current structure just basically makes that impossible. I mean, look, even the very popular profile videos that have been put together for the majors, like sometimes by the time the ones come out that were supposed to be of the favorites, they're already out of the tournament.
Yes.
Because they planned the release for that to be like the semifinal thing, or the beginning of the grand final day, and turns out the big favorites actually went out. I think that happened the famous Envious Fnatic major, or the Olofmeister game. I think that was one of those where they were supposed to be the final. That was supposed to be the grand final. They were by far the 2 best teams, and then because of brackets and it was the Envious who got upset, they ended up playing in the quarterfinals, and the same thing happened.
It was Fnatic that got upset, but yeah. It depends actually. Which major were we talking about for that one? Oh, the Olaf boost one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was for that because they lost to the simple Hellraisers.
Yeah,
it was that Mirage game, if you remember. Yeah. No, that's definitely the case. By the way, here's the reason why I will always sell the narrative world, because obviously that's my world, so I know it inside out. Other areas where, again, I didn't, so people are going to say, sadly, like, you didn't do this, but another area where, in my opinion, you can get mad buy-in from the teams is if you do this approach right, you can even monetize and promote bad things that happen. I'll give an example using your team. If that was a league, right, and ENCE was in it, and then OG was in it, dude, we'd have featurettes just about the LXEB thing, and LXEB versus Alu, and we'd have, past teammates commenting, like, mate, that alone is like, it's like, this is one thing I think has been very lost from our day back in 1.6. The really smart players in 1.6 already understood, I'm not only played to shoot people with the crosshair, so they understood, you know what, if I get eliminated, I should go on the desk if they ask me to, I should do an interview if they ask me to, let's at least get some media out there, let's at least get my face somewhere, don't just go out on day one and then, radio silence, because my org's not going to like that. Like, basically, the idea is the storytelling aspect can just enhance any aspect. Even, as I say, grudge matches, negatives, downfall of teams. Like, literally, the storytelling could actually elevate, in my opinion, the interest in all aspects of the league.
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. I suppose just to tie this back to the very beginning on this front, the other sort of implication here, obviously, is that I think Monty actually retweeted me my tweet about this, which was, obviously very controversial. Many people did not like the take on it, but I think the end outcome of the Super League was obviously going to be like an American franchise league. Like, it may have started as a Champions League replacement where the teams have more control. You look at all the people around the table, it's very obvious where it was going to go. And to your point about Monty's idea for League of Legends at the very beginning of this podcast or show, I think actually for esports in particular, the big advantage esports has over sports, besides the fact that generally speaking, the games are more accessible than most sports, doesn't necessarily hold true for basketball or soccer, but for most other sports, I think it's true, is the fact that it's digital, which means that for the most part, it's very global. It's the same everywhere. So I actually think sort of breaking everything by country is just limiting the potential. Now, what it does is it gives you a little bit more defensibility. If instead you had 30 franchises globally for League of Legends, that'd be less than there currently are teams. So there would have to be some losers if you were to scale back instead of just artificially limiting it on the way up. And in many cases, it's too late to do this at this point. But I just think in that scenario, like, you just end up with a much more controlled league overall. And I think many of the folks around the table who are planning Super League must have specifically wanted that, because remember, a lot of those teams are now owned by American investors.
Yes.
As opposed
that is
to
the American way of thinking, of course.
Yeah,
yes.
As opposed to the original families who bought the teams, that founded the teams, etc. A lot of them are now owned by American teams, and I think that was largely the thinking behind it. So hence the sort of the comparison to Flashpoint, and I guess what way we were talking about it through the lens of what the end state would have been, as opposed to just the Champions League portion, which would be still, I think, an improved experience, but not to the same effect. I think it would just be a necessary step in the middle. I think the outcome would have to be like a fully locked in league of its own.
I'll give you a quick analogy to explain another aspect of this that unfortunately a lot of fans aren't going to get past, which is realistically, they are just effectively communicating. For my selfish desires of what I would like right now, you with your company that costs potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, might even be expenses, maybe you make revenue if you're a very, very big team, with your business, just do what I want. No reason given, just do what I want because I want it, right? So here's the analogy, right? I have fans ask me all the time, can you just please put all your content on Spotify? No, because I would make no money from it then. Why would I do that? Like, I know you want to listen to it on your phone. I know you want to listen to it on your MP3 player in the gym. Unfortunately, I make no money from that. So right now, Like, I would be a fool to do that for you. It wouldn't benefit my life whatsoever. So similarly, right, an aspect I think is very misunderstood, because I'm seeing it behind the scenes play out right now in the franchise leagues in esports, particularly, by the way, the League of Legends ones, is there are owners in those leagues, which, remember, they've also locked in with, like, 8, 10 teams, not many franchises. Fans say every year, expand it, bring 2 more teams in, bring 4 more teams in. I hear from some of the top owners, I want some of these motherfuckers out, because I have to share the revenue with these guys. I like promote my brand. I get the best players. I give them the best condition. I win the games. I win the championship. And then the guy who has the 10th best franchise sometimes is the guy who puts in the least effort, has the worst players, has no fan base. I saw some graphic the other day where there was a big esports org where they were getting like 1,000 views a month on League of Legends videos, and they're in the LCS, mate. So when I see that, right, those owners, this is one of the reasons I actually think why they want to do something like the European Super League as well. They don't want to be in like the Premier League ultimately and share all that income with like teams that are nobodies, and by the way, might not have invested fuck all to get to their point where they get the X amount of TV deal, and then you're like, well, I've spent 400 million to get to this, and you spent 10. Like, eventually, by the way, that's going to feel unfair. Now, listen, I know no fan's going to cry boo-hoo for the guy with the millions, but we're on about the principle here. It's not about who the guy is who has the money. It's the principle of, like, who should get the money or who earned the money, etc. Like, essentially, what they never bother explaining in that scenario is, like, when you share profits like this, you're not going to want to share with someone who... It's almost like the ridiculous, like... like the straw man that people always use of like, oh, but if you just give people money, no one will work. Like, some people will, but some people won't, sure. Not everyone will just choose not to, but some people won't. And you will. Eventually, I can tell you, I had this myself. As soon as I started paying a large amount of tax, I stopped thinking it was cool that so many people could just fucking get so much for nothing. It didn't seem as fun anymore to be taxed that much, and know that doesn't potentially go to help anyone that's me or anyone related to me. That doesn't feel fair eventually.
Yeah, the other piece of this, by the way, is I think one of the things that I highlighted is many of the sports teams, I think, frankly, it's similar to esports teams as well. People don't necessarily always invest in solely because of what they think the financial return is, at least as backed by cash flows, which is how you generally would value assets. But rather, a big part of it is, if I were a billionaire, I would want to own a sports team because I think it just would be fun to own a sports team. I don't think I'm ever selling my stake in ends because I think it's just however well the team does or however poorly. I just think it's fun to have ownership in a sports team. I think many people share that sentiment. So to the extent that that's the case, like, you're already not talking about something that you're investing in. You hopefully are making money over time on it, but you may not. In the meantime, you have, in the cases of some of the most popular teams, I think like FC Barcelona, who, despite being one of the best revenue generators in all of sports and one of the biggest brands globally, actually has like hundreds and hundreds of millions of debt. And why is that? Well, one, it's their strategy of acquiring like big name stars. That's one piece of it. But the other piece is their fans are going to be unhappy if they don't win. Yes. So, they could do what they could do is be sustainable, choose not to pay players more money, and then they would start losing. And then the fans would also be unhappy. So I think it's one of these scenarios where I think people don't always necessarily think through what the outcome of that is. Because I don't think that if all of a sudden, let's say, these Premier League teams, so like Manchester United, who were supposed to go off to Super League, if they actually just cut back, as pissed off as their fans may have been about the Super League idea for whatever reason, if they all of a sudden cut their payroll in half and stopped acquiring good players, and they just became like a bottom tier Premier League team who still stayed in the league, but just wasn't competing for the title, wasn't qualifying for Champions League, do you think those fans would be happy? Absolutely not. And yet they're not the ones. I mean, they're supporting the team, they're buying merchandise, they're going to games, etc. But they are actually not footing the, at times, like, tens of millions of losses and hundreds of millions of debt. And that's the piece that people don't always think about. I think given how big and successful some of these brands are as brands, people sometimes overlook what the financial results are.
I mean, I can literally tie this into like real life anecdotal evidence that I've seen myself, mate, which is when people, as I said, with these mental resistances to the league, a lot of the things they came up with were almost like almost like sophistry, like they weren't real arguments. Like people were trying to think it destroys the soul of the game. And, like, what about people who are like heritage supporters? They've supported that club for their entire lives. Like, here's the problem with that, lurppis. That already had died off when I was a boy. In fact, when the Premier League started, that was dying off. In my school, can you guess which team most boys were a fan of?
Manchester United?
Of course. Because they were winning the Premier League every season, mate. And so it didn't matter that, like, we lived in fucking the northeast of England, mate. Manchester's in the northwest. In theory, we should be the direct rivals of them. Like, that would be like an England fan just being a fan of Scotland because they have better players. But that's the problem. Already then, it was about winning. That was the identity that a fan supported, right? Then, as you say, just as you're seeing in esports now, in my opinion, the ship sailed a long time ago that I support Team X. I support Team X when they've got good enough players. Now, they might be conditional like that. Like, I'll give you an example. I was a Liverpool fan as a boy. Tell you what, the years I tuned out of watching Liverpool, was when they actually weren't that good, mate. When they've been like a team that can win the league now, I watch a few games, I get back into it. That means I'm not really a Liverpool fan. I'm a Liverpool fan in certain conditions. Now, the reason I know this is the case in modern sports, for esports, it's obvious. Like we say, mate, if you leave a big brand, all the best players, and they go to a nobody brand, the nobody brand immediately has a lot of people watching, and the big brand has nobody watching. That's obvious. Your team did it, obviously. Here's the example that I would give. Anyone who's followed the NBA will know this, right? I remember in the mid-2000s when the Lakers and the Celtics sucked, right? They weren't very good. But the Lakers had Kobe, and at the time he was the league's leading scorer, right? This is mental, mate. Think about the heritage of the Celtics and the Lakers. If you ever watched those old documentaries, it's not trolling. Like, people in Boston used to actually do stuff like, like poison the fucking food and, like, fucking ring bells outside their windows all night long to keep more, because they hated those guys. It was a competitive rivalry, right? When Kobe was, like, basically the reason you went to the game, even as a Celtics fan, there would be loads of people in the Celtics home stadium wearing Laker jerseys, celebrating when he scored points. And even then, half the seats were empty because both teams sucked. So it's like the very premise they're trying to present doesn't exist. That is something that is many decades old, as far as I can tell, which, by the way, ties into the reason why in all these sports the payrolls are insane, because it's really about talent acquisition. Anyone who's watching the NBA right now, did any of you care about the Nets for the last 15 years? No. But I tell you what, you fucking care the last few seasons, don't you? Because now the players they've got instantly make them part of the conversation. Everyone's interested. Everyone wants to know what's going to go on. The drama's insane. Like that shows it has fuck all to do with like where you're from, what team you like to support. To me, that's like a totally overblown argument. I don't even think it's real. And in esports, definitely not. If Simple leaves Navi tomorrow and he joins Gambit fucking instantly has a legion of fans that they never had before.
Yeah, I just think it's like nostalgia. Really, like people think back to how it was, go to local sports games with their dad growing up, and that's the lens they view that through. But you can just tell. Look, I actually think this is the one case where esports has been a little bit ahead of the curve on traditional sports, in that I think it's only happened in the last, really only happened, I think, with LeBron changing teams again. I think, and then KD. So LeBron leaving the Heat, and then KD leaving Oklahoma City, I think was the first time that people started realizing that, okay, actually, people are now fans of the players, and that they take the team that they're on to watch
they have all the
player.
power.
Yeah. And I think esports was actually a little bit ahead of the fact. I think many people, generally speaking, thought that it was behind, in that the teams had not yet grown that kind of following. I will, by the way, point out that I think mibr might be the only exception to this. If you look at viewership numbers pre and post the two roster changes that we've done, they've actually stuck, and that's very rare for esports.
Yeah, people don't know the mibr lineup that was in its second tournament at Flashpoint 2 was still giving the biggest numbers of the entire tournament, and they didn't even make the final.
Yeah, by far. I just think for the longest time in esports, it's been, like you said, with the Gods and Fnatic example, that was a time when everybody switched. Everybody wanted to watch Flusha, JW, and Crims. So they started watching Gods, and whom at the time were just basically a complete nobody organization.
Sure.
And I think sports are actually getting to that point now. Everybody loves the Nets now. No one cares about the Rockets. That's just the reality. Nobody cared about the Warriors last season because both Curry and Klay Thompson were out and KD had left. there was actually a tidbit in a recent Curry article on ESPN where they said like, well, the Golden State viewership on their local TV channel is up like 100% from last year, which is like, yeah, of course, because Curry's again one of the best players in the world, and last year it was just like a bad lottery team that had no chance of winning. It's like you said, I think fandom is conditional. There's a lot of people who will look at the results and they've, spent years and years watching on and off, but they will tune in more when their team is winning because it's just not fun to watch a bad team play. Like no matter how long you've been a fan of it, that's just the reality.
And by the way, the area where it's going to get even darker with even no European Super League in soccer is, I'll tell you what, the next generation is done. Like they're not even conditional, lurppis. Like, as I said, so I give the example, when I was a boy, they were all Man United fans because they were a fan of the team that won, right? Then, when I got to be an adult, let's say when I was like 25, like, yeah, that would be about, no, let's say like late 20s to my early 30s. So that's like 28, 29, right? Because I'm trying to put it to the age when Messi was in his prime, right? Mate, I've never seen anything like this in my life. My whole life, if you wear a football jersey in the UK, it's an English team, of course. Like, even if you're a glory sport, it's Man United or Chelsea when they got good or Man City in the modern day. Dude, you wouldn't believe how many children I would see walking around my hometown wearing a Lionel Messi or Ronaldo jersey. That was an alien concept. Not only are they not English players, like it'd be one thing, like when there was actually some like English players went to those like foreign teams, that'd be one thing. These were just people that they just picked the best player. Whoever the best player was, they were going to be a fan of him no matter where they grew up. And that is esports. That just is what esports is now.
Yeah, it's just gonna be very tough, and I think I actually think many organizations are seeing this. I think with ENS we circumvented it just because Finland's such a small country that it's really taken. Like ENS has really taken on the identity of the Finnish national team, I think, in the eyes of the fans, and that sort of like circumvented that issue. And I think MIBR is sort of similar just because of the branding and the long history. But I think generally speaking, I just think it's really hard to build a relevant brand today unless you just happen to be very successful competitively, simply because it's hard to become very popular without competitive success. I think it's very costly / almost impossible to buy success currently in most of the modern games. And I think unless you're successful and for a prolonged period of time, it's really hard to build any brand loyalty, because like you said, I think the youngsters of today, they just view the world differently. It's digital. They're not constrained by whichever small town they grew up in. I mean, when you're, like you said, when you're little, you kind of get taught that you're just rooting for the local team, and then at some point, if you watch a lot of sports, so for example, when I was a kid, I'd stay up to watch the NHL finals because I'm a big hockey fan. And at some point, like, it doesn't matter if like I grew up watching some specific NHL team. It's just probably like, some player who was there, like whatever their logo looked like, what their name was, like some completely relevant reason, given I'm not even from the same continent. But over time, you just end up watching so much of whichever team happened to be good in that era. And over time, you either like watching that team or you stop watching. Right? Because it has to be either one of those. Like, you have to like watching the team, even if it's because you just like to watch a sport and whoever is good. But then once you kind of come around on that and you realize that actually I just like watching who's good instead of liking to watch this team because I just decided that I had an allegiance to this club for whatever irrational, non-existent reason. I think once you kind of realize that, I think it just opens the floodgates, and then all of a sudden you're actually free to watch just any team. Really, and I think then you just don't build. It's really hard to build the same kind of brand loyalty, and you're kind of competing for every fan every single day. You're always competing for the same fan again. They might be your fan today. They might buy your jersey this year. Are they buying it again next year? You're going to have to do something next year to buy their fandom again. And like you said, I think the kids today, it's not conditional anymore. I think it's actually more than that. I don't think you even get the conditional piece of it. You'd have to earn it again every day, every year.
Oh, for sure. Like, I mean, to give you a very brief example. I know Richard, in my interview with him, basically made this point about esports content, which is totally accurate, which is esports content doesn't compete against other esports content. It competes against all possible entertainment and media. Like, it competes against you going and watching Netflix or watching a sport or anything, like playing a game yourself. Like, there's a big reason, by the way, why there's not a game in this universe where more people, like, what sport do more people actually play the real pro level version of than watch? Like, it's the other way around. Esports is the opposite. Like, we still haven't even vaguely got all the people into the esports side. There's a billion people play the game. So, and similarly, right, another aspect I think a lot of people haven't actually thought of is, I'll make it philosophical. The difference, even in the arguments, when they talk about the old version, which is the idea that if I grew up in the area of London that's Arsenal, right, then I support Arsenal no matter what. And then, in theory, in the old days, even if they're bad, I should still be watching. And, you know, it's like if you're a Manchester City fan before they got all the investment, you know, you're just a die-hard fan and you'll watch them even when they're shit. And it's like, this sucks. But, you know, that scenario there, you're not watching for entertainment. What you're watching for, that's religion, mate. You have a religion in your family. It's called being a Man City fan. And come hell or high water, you will support that team. What people do now is called entertainment. You better entertain them. And so as a result, if Man City's really good, a fan who isn't even from Manchester watches them. If Man City's terrible, that modern day fan won't be a fan of Man City. They'll be a fan of whoever it is, might be United in that sense. They're the more popular. So to me, in esports, we just never had the original aspect. We understood it was entertainment from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually funny the way you put it against like playing, because I remember there were like times when back when I was playing, and like, you know, there'd be these online leagues, so like NGL, IEM, that we'd have to play the qualifiers for. And I remember there would be times when somebody on the team would just say like, hey, like, you know, Fnatic's playing SK today, like, can we just cut practice at 9 p.m. and watch the game? And usually most of the people would just say like, I'd rather play than watch, and like, you know, I'll just catch the game from a demo later or something. But there would be some people who would say like, I would like to watch, which is kind of actually implicitly making that choice that for them, it was more fun to watch other people who are very good play than to play themselves.
It's actually the reason why, if people don't know, actually, when I used to try and do my content, it was a lot harder to get people involved with doing the content, because basically top pro players, a lot of them weren't actually nerds about the game. Like, here's the difference. They didn't sit down and go, wow, and now I'll watch the other great player. They were like, listen, I'll try and play him in the server, but I'm not a fucking nerd. Like, they weren't fans in the same. Yeah, I agree. That was definitely the sentiment back then. Like, most of them, in fact, basically, there was some pros where they were just good at the game and they didn't even get why people were watching demos. Like, one of the reasons back in the old days when you had to ask for the POV demos, you didn't just get them automatically. The reason there was so few, mate, is some of those players almost thought you were like creepy that you were asking for the demos. They were like, why do you want it? Like, you know, like, and we were, because to me it was like, well, it's got like the best possible fucking play. They'd just be like, nah, it's a bit weird, isn't it? Just watch the fucking HLTV getting garbage.
It's different, and I think that's look, I think, just to go once again all the way back to the beginning, I think just the dynamics of like what fans actually want today, and this goes into what their stated versus actually revealed preferences are. The stated preference is that they just want things to stay as they are, and they want their team to try to make it to the highest league through relegation, or stay in the highest league and try to win the championship. That's what a lot of people will say. I think the revealed preference, if you look at viewership numbers, etc., is that people tend to watch the best teams play the most. And I don't think a lot of the time, I don't think it necessarily matters that much. I mean, it'll matter on a global scale, but that's largely driven by just like access to broadcast. But so, you know, so for example, if you have the two best Premier League teams play in the Premier League, maybe that game isn't broadcast everywhere the same as it would be if they played against each other in the Champions League, for example. So there might be a delta there, but at the same time, like, that's who you're watching. And to the extent that the viewership is higher for those teams than some of the other teams, like, that's what people care about. And that's the reality. And it is a business. You do need to keep it going. Otherwise, it's just going to disappear. And to the extent that that's the case, and you agree with that, you have to give people what they actually want to watch. And I think it's one of these things where a lot of the time the minority actually has an outsized impact on public opinion, because the minority tends to be the loudest. And I think the silent majority rarely comments on this stuff, because they sort of just like, they either take what is on, what the entertainment form is, and they either watch it or they don't. they're not necessarily trying to optimize it to fit what they want. They'll just do something else, like you said. If the grand final of Cologne isn't something that I want to watch, like I'm just not going to watch. I'm going to do something else. It might be, I might watch Netflix. I might read. I might do something totally different. But I don't feel constrained by the option of just having to do that. Whereas then, the quote unquote hardcore fan, a lot of the time, like they want that to be theirs because that's what they're doing. And like you said, it's entertainment. You're competing with all the other options, which is coincidentally why we have said many times that I think LA is actually potentially the single toughest esports market globally. And the reason is that in many of these cities, so you think if you're Dallas, you think if you're, just think where the other like franchises are in North America, say you're Toronto even, I guess Toronto's maybe a bad example, say you're Dallas, say you're Atlanta, like how much entertainment do you have on a given day that you can choose from? In some of these towns, you can actually be like a reasonably meaningful live event for people to pick and choose from, even for people who are necessarily not primarily interested in esports. If you're in Los Angeles, you have 2 basketball teams, you have multiple hockey teams, you have multiple football teams, you have world-class comedians, entertainers, musicians, basically every single day of the week. And every single day of the week, you have to choose, by the way, and almost nobody can even afford to do this like every day. They have to pick and choose to begin with.
Sure.
And they're not only pick and choosing between, let's just say, an ESL tournament in Southern California or an ECS tournament that used to happen here every now and then. They're actually choosing between that and a Lakers game and and a Rams game and a Clippers game and all the concerts that are here, then all the comedians who come to town. And it's all of those things. And it's even, by the way, to some extent, it's even like restaurants. Like restaurants you can go to with your friends and hang out. Like it's all those different things, and they're all competing ultimately for the same wallet share and also the same time share, no matter how different they are. And that's why I think people sometimes think about markets in a little bit skewed way when it comes to esports, and why I think sometimes the successes of live events in some towns don't replicate for others, even if you just kind of look at the demographics and you think, well, there's this and this many under 35-year-olds, this and this many players of this game in this market, it might not actually still mean that you're going to get the same participation rate from those people.
Also, to tie into another point, it was one of the first ones we made about like the talent compression, where you're going to basically remove, instead of it being diluted, you're going to concentrate the talent, right? Another factor with that is it means each game, in theory, is going to be of a higher quality. Now, the reason why I bring that up is another area people are going to make a massive mistake here when they go, but why would you change the way football's done? Because nearly all major sports in the world are having a downturn. They're having less people watching. One of the reasons why, this is funny, because in esports, we've gone through this in a very short amount of time. We're trying to get out of it. They also have the equivalent of viewed hours. That's why they try to have 82 NBA games. That's why they're going to add another NFL game. They want to just get the raw number of amount of hours watched up so they can say to the sponsor, it justifies the money that we want to take, right? Here's the reason I know that is not what the current generation, the current consumer wants. Because the fastest growing sports is stuff like esports on a lesser degree, but we still pump the calendar way too much. I would say the UFC is the obvious example. Think of the way the UFC tailors their product. You don't watch every single week. There aren't 2 games a week. You don't have to watch. Because the problem with that scenario, right, is it's the equivalent of like feeling like you didn't watch every episode of a long TV show. It's like I watch episode 3 and then episode 8 and I'm trying to figure out on episode 14, like why is this guy like that? I would never have a chance to follow it. In fact, I wouldn't bother, would I? I would go, listen, if I wasn't interested in all the episodes, I'm not watching this show. UFC is like, people go, right, a card is coming up with a big fight I want to watch in a month, right? Even then they don't watch the whole card. They watch the main card, like the top 5 fights, and then they don't watch the undercard. It's like they've actually tailored it so that you can, not only can everyone access what they want, you can watch the undercard fights if you're the super fan. Otherwise, you just watch the title fight or you watch the top 5 fights. That it's more like almost like you get to choose your entertainment. You get to take it in the dose you want, This idea that you have to basically be all in and watch every game of a league, I don't think that's the future, mate. I know it's not for me. I mean, as you said, like you watch the odd game like on a second monitor, but you aren't sitting down like you would for the Super Bowl. You aren't sitting down with the popcorn and the pre-game and the fucking everyone shut up, don't annoy me for 3 hours. Like no one's doing that for a regular season game, pretty much, unless it's the big televised game, right?
Yeah, and I mean, not only that, like you're not changing your plans to do that when there's a bunch of games all the time. Like I will completely block my calendar for playoffs games in the NFL, NBA, etc. that I want to watch, and I'll just make sure that I have no distractions, that I'm actually able to sit on the couch and watch the game, whether by myself or with friends or whomever. But I'm not doing that for whichever 37th semifinal of a pretty large Counter-Strike tournament in the last 18 months is taking place. Would I do that if there were like two annual leagues or something, and those were the only major things, or I even don't think that the majors are that different from the masses at this point. I guess we'll see when and if the Stockholm major takes place at the end of the year, how that feels, especially if that's played online, given Sweden's kind of lax COVID policies. That might be different, but I can tell you that over the last couple of years, I haven't even thought that the majors have been that different, given how the calendar has worked out, how all the games have worked out, etc. And I think that's a problem. I think there's just too much content, and everybody talks about how successful the NFL is, the best sports league worldwide. And they play 16 games, I guess 17 now. But to your point, it's not about how many games you have if the quality is just better for the games that you do have. That's why again, I do think that, you've read the same suggestions for the NBA. One of them is like a 48 game season. I think that would actually be the best of them. I don't remember the match breakdown between the different conferences, divisions as currently constructed, but I think the best version of the NBA would be no conferences, 48 games. And I think if my team, whoever that happens to be at that time, based on the players who are there, only played 48 games, I feel like each of those matters a lot more than if there's 82. When you're playing 82 games, there isn't a single game in the entire season that actually matters. Collectively, many of them will, but no individual game will matter. Now, like you're a Lakers fan, you know that their playoff / play-in hopes will almost certainly be decided tonight when they play the Blazers, is recorded on a Friday, because they're gonna either have the head-to-head matchup over them, or they're going to be behind both them and Mavs. So it's on an individual basis today, that game matters, but in the grand scheme of things, like no individual game matters. Like the point about the last round versus the rounds leading up to it. It just doesn't matter. There's too many. 82 games is just way too much. And it might be that financially for the time being it's better because you can sell more tickets, you have more broadcast hours, etc. But I would bet that in 20 years there is going to be no sports league that plays 80 games a year. That's just not going to work. People don't consume that way, and I think you'll get higher viewership peaks if you do something. If you have a structure that people can actually follow. And I think it's exactly like you said about TV shows. If you fall too far behind on a TV show, you're not going back. Back in the days before OTT services, when you actually had to watch TV shows from TV, you just tune out from some shows because you missed 2 episodes. You'd have whatever other reasons you couldn't watch. You tune out, and now you have no idea what's going on. You're just not watching anymore. That doesn't happen because of OTT services. You can stream anything whenever you'd like, but it's the same thing, same exact problem.
The funny thing is as well, the fact that the NFL managed to get into this prime position basically loops back into the beginning of why I said once you have the teams, then you can really turn the narrative people loose, because people know it. The shoulder content in the NFL is hands down the best in the entire world. Like, actually, funnily enough, the UFC is the only other thing I think comes close. They also put in like massive amount of work for like behind the scenes shows and like countdowns and all these things, and they hype it properly. Now, the funny thing is, the NFL also got into a position where the reason they don't have an 80-game season was just luck. It's because the physical constraints of the sport mean that, like, quite frankly, I know a lot of fans and I know a lot of players rather didn't want this 17th game added. They were like, why would I want another chance to get injured? Because if anyone's ever watched Super Bowls, if you're actually a super fan, half of what ruins the Super Bowl is the amount of the odds that both teams get there with all the best starters available. It's zero. Even if they do, like a guy's like when T.O. was like on half a leg in a Super Bowl, like, no, I wanted to watch him play at full strength to see if he was going to win the game. But okay, They have 16 games in a season. You know what? I can follow 16 games. I can get into that. I mean, I can go even further, right? Because since I'm a hardcore fan, when I get into something, I can tell you, the reason it's stupid I never got into the NFL so many years ago, mate, because I had like initial resistance to it, is because I love the history of it, right? It took me probably, I would say, 15 years to get really knowledgeable about NBA history because I had to study so much. Like, I obviously can't watch all those games. Tell you what, in the NFL, this is not an exaggeration. I might have watched every game Peyton Manning has ever played, because it was only 16 per season plus however many in the playoffs. Like I might have only had to watch, like, off the top of my head, like, what's that going to be, like 200 games?
Yep.
And I had the whole guy's entire career. Like, I did that in a couple of years. That was doable. Now, listen, I'm not saying they would do it, but my point is, like, you can follow 16 games. If you even miss one or two of those when they play the shit team, you still got the main gist of it. Whereas, as we're saying, we do the opposite in the NHL. Like, the NHL's the one for me, because the problem with the NHL is, it's because it's not the sport where the individual star can dominate every time. Doesn't matter how much I like Sidney Crosby, he's going to have a game where he gets a 0-0-0 and he just has, like, you know, a couple of shots that miss. That isn't that sick, unfortunately. So basically, I do the opposite. In the NHL, I'll tune in for the big game that's like, you know, them playing the rival, and I'll go for the playoffs. So in that scenario, I am the guy who's like, fuck, like, let's get into this. Like, where were they at? And is this guy playing well this season and stuff? I'm doing the opposite scenario then. Like, I'm sort of lost, and I'm just hoping that the best element of it gets me through. Now, also, the other thing to think of, obviously, there is, if just the best part existed, wouldn't everyone watch? Like, you know, how many, because you know, the NHL's the sport I know among all my friends where we watch a lot of sports. The NHL has become the one where you just tune in for the Stanley Cup. That's it. You don't watch the regular season. Come on, that's probably the worst quality sport for the regular season. Like, the games are just too ridiculous, and you just fucking rest people and stuff. Like, it's a nightmare. So in my opinion, you want to go for the concentration again.
Yeah, I just think look, you want everything to be concentrated. You want the matches to be concentrated. You want the talent to be concentrated. You just want the best of the best to the extent that you can. And I think in many cases, by reducing the number of games, reducing the number of teams, reducing the number of leagues, I think you actually even end up with a bigger pie, because, as we said, you just get more into things if you feel like you can consume all of it. And I think to the extent that you can't, it's just harder to get into it. And by the way, I can even tell you that watching Counter-Strike from California doesn't make it the easiest to be always into, like, every single thing, because many of the games that, you know, start in these tournaments, the first games in the group stages are like 3 a.m. my time, which is like completely unwatchable, which means that, like, by the time you get to best of threes, which, by the way, who knows why we're playing best of threes in every group stage now? I know the players love it because they think that there's more security and it's less random, but that just makes it far less interesting to watch. But by the time we get to those, like, the first best of three is at 3 a.m. every day. Sometimes it's 2 games at once, and the second one usually starts at 6. That's like watchable. But the games prior, you just can't watch. Luckily, what they've done with the playoffs is they start the first game now usually around 7 a.m. or so, which means that it's actually completely normal hours and people can watch. The problem, obviously, is that cuts into the workday, which means you can never be 100% focused. What you do is you have the game on your second monitor, or you have it on the TV on the side, and you kind of stay on top of it, but you can't ever get into it the same way as if you were watching the whole time, which, by the way, I think in large part explains why people get more out of live event experiences as it comes to esports. I don't my personal preference, I don't really care whether there's 5,000 people next to me yelling. In fact, I actually kind of like watching by myself and not listening, not hearing that. But I do think if you're at an event, you just end up paying more attention, which is why you end up getting more out of it. Because I think, like we said, there's very few events that you actually fully dedicate yourself to, and you don't think about anything else. You're not in your phone. You're not checking the news at the same time. You're not browsing over things. You're not checking the scores. You're not texting people, but you're actually just watching. And I think if you can't get fully into something, you're just going to derive less value out of it. And the longer the games take, the harder it is to do that. That's another density piece. Nobody's like, I'm sorry, nobody's watching a full best of 5 doing nothing for the entire 6 hours that goes 5 maps. Nobody, not one person on this planet. 7 billion is not enough. Nobody is doing that. You just dilute the entire experience. You know what people would watch? If you did $1 million tournament that was only best of ones among everybody. People would not miss like half those games. They would watch their team every single game.
Put it this way, one thing I've always suggested, and if Valve actually cared, I think it would be one of the easiest things to execute ever. You know when they bring out a new map? So listen, Ancient might be the worst example because it looks pretty terrible, but let's say it was a normal map, as bad as some of the old maps were. Yeah. Why don't they just have a tournament where they just say, listen, TO, we're going to block out a week for you here. Here's like literally $500,000. Just invite the top 10 teams. Tell them all, look, yeah, no one's going to treat you like it's the major. You're not going to be a fool if you lose. It's a brand new map. But I'll tell you what, who the fuck wouldn't tune in to see what's going to happen? What would happen when every team has to play and all the best teams? I would watch myself, no matter how shit the map is. Of course, the spectacle alone would be nuts. By the way, that leads into one last topic we can sort of do very briefly here before we wrap the episode, which is another thing I've pushed for the last few years. I've probably even brought it up on this show, is I feel like E-League was way too ahead of the time. Because that's one of the worst things about ideas. An idea ahead of its time will die and look stupid. And then the guy who does it 15 years later, the same idea is a genius. So the obvious one is when they did the Clash for Cash, their problem is because they're boomers, they thought like TV and they were like, well, the final of the last major was Astralis versus VP, so we should just have that be the one in the summer. And they didn't understand. In our sport, that's like doing the Super Bowl rematch 4 years later. Like those teams might not even vaguely be good. And obviously we all know Virtus Pro had already gone off a cliff. Yeah. Whereas at the time I always said, if they'd have actually known, because at the time the match to make was Astralis versus FaZe, if you remember, that was the rivalry. That matchup would have fucking popped like a motherfucker. Everyone in Counter-Strike would have watched that. It could have even, by the way, been an insane match. So to me, there's another avenue I wish people would explore, is the big money match. You get instead of the prize purse for the whole tournament, that's the prize purse for this match. And teams know they have 2 weeks to prep for this one. And you build content. You know what the match is. You already know what the final is. There already is a final. If you do that right, listen, I know fans going to, it's only one match. Listen, it would be the most epic match. It would be a match, because I think of it, it'd be like a great World Championship boxing match, The scale of it would be insane. And you could also get a lot of eyes from the mainstream. There's another thing. You're not going to get the mainstream to watch a tournament where the best team can go out in the first round, or some shit team makes the final. There's not even a hook for them there. If it's a championship, like essentially they're going to think like boxing. Oh, so these are the two best teams. Okay, right. What's the story behind them? Well, this team won this tournament. The story sells itself, mate. Yeah,
I tend to agree. I think that format has potential. I know there's actually some teams that thought about doing something similar.
Between themselves.
Yeah.
That would have been cool as well. Yeah.
But that was, we, for example, have had some similar conversations on the MIBR side, but that was before COVID, and then that kind of, put everything to the side. But I think there's cool opportunities like that you could put together. And again, it's just, I just think it's going to happen sometime in the next couple of years. I don't know whether it's this year, don't know whether it's in 3 years, or whether it's, the 5th year from today, or whether it's the 7th year. I don't know. But at some point, people will see a decline in viewership, and it'll just be the fact that at some point the game will stop growing unless there's constant updates and new maps, and maybe there's CSGO 2 at some point, something else that keeps the game growing while new games like Valorant are coming out. But when that happens, people will finally feel like they're going to be willing to experiment a little bit, because they don't mind looking silly if things don't work out as much, because the status quo is also not acceptable as is. And I think if you get to that point, I think many people who are against change today will actually see what change looks like implemented in practice, and I think many of them will actually find it preferable, because I think the entertainment will just be better. But like you said, not today. And I think that what people say they want is actually different from what their actual actions reveal that they do actually want in reality.
Put it this way, here's the obvious example, right? Because you made me think there when you said about MIBR, right? This is what would change the whole industry. By the way, in the same way as right now, everyone's complaining. I'll give you the perfect analogy for all of this. Everyone's complaining like a motherfucker right now that these YouTubers, the Paul brothers, are having these big boxing matches. The same fan that complains about that, by the way, wasn't watching all the fucking normal heavyweight title fights and the super middleweight fight. They don't really watch boxing. They just believe in a fictional idea of what boxing represents, a gentleman's sport and its history and its respect. But the same person complaining is also watching these fights, by the way. They're watching these freak show fights, and this is a script. They're still watching, though. So what's mad is it's like clickbait. They're clicking it, but then they're mad that they clicked it, right? This is the problem, right? What would change the game in the same way as that's basically potentially going to wreck MMA, by the way, because some of the MMA fighters make so little. They're like, why don't I go and fight that guy and make millions, even if he's fucking an idiot? Like, this is what would change the game. I just thought of it now. Imagine a world, listen, I know while they were MIBR, they never were the top team. Obviously, it was when they were SK, etc. Imagine a world where MIBR had those old Brazilians, and let's say, we're just hypothetical here, they are the best team, right? And let's say the second best team is Na'Vi and Simple, right? I'll tell you what, I've perfectly picked those viewer bases on purpose. If those two teams, MIBR and Na'Vi, do a big money show match like this with a proper build-in, weeks in advance to promote, etc., it will literally, I'm telling you right now, it will do as good or better numbers than the final of ESL's biggest event, unless it's a major. That, like, as in, it will have like 700,000 viewers. Meanwhile, I'm going to guess, like, off the top of my head, that, like, fucking the final between Gambit and Virtus Pro, that was no way that was 700,000. I'm going to guess it was probably, like 250,000 or something, 300,000. Like, the second that would happen, that would be a game changer for the whole industry. The ripple off, that would be mental. Because all the big fan base teams would realise, wait a minute, why do I need ESL? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, that was a good point on the sort of like the weird boxing matchups, and also tying it into clickbait. Because the funny thing is, like, I don't believe that I complain about stuff. I'm not going to say I don't, but like I don't believe that the complaining is the part that actually changes it. I think when people vote with their wallets, that's what actually will cause change over time. So, yes. For example, to the extent that there's clickbait headlines, I go out of my way to not click them, just because to the extent that you do, you actually end up with more of those. Because that's it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you put them out and you get people to click, no matter what they say, as long as they click, the data says that it works and it continues happening. So I try to go out of my way to not click on links like that. So it's sort of similar with this, as in, like, people say that they want one thing, but actually they do the other, and the other might not always be like competitively pure. It might not actually be what you and I want, and I think in many cases would not be what we want. But the reality is that I think many of the people who are against change would actually end up watching that, like the extreme version of that, potentially the most, regardless of what they state today.
Yes. And by the way, again, I'll just loop it back in the beginning. We can end the episode here. The reason why, because I agree, I've always said, if you really want like the biggest viewership and the most hyped matches, just let me literally pick what the bracket is. I'll literally make them all for you. Now, here's the beauty, guys. If it's the top 8 teams in the bracket, I don't need to do it. It can just happen like that. I don't need to ruin the competitive integrity. We're just going to get those matches. Like, I'll take the odds that, the 4th best team doesn't beat the 2nd best team. Okay, that's a nicer odd than, just throw 40 teams in there and see who makes the final. Like, I don't like those odds. I don't care how good you are.
That's why I make the final point. That's why some of those like small invitational tournaments used to be really fun to watch. Even going back to like the Arbalete best of 4, yes. best of 4, best of 5, whichever that was called. Yep. United shouldn't have been at that tournament, but that was sort of the custom admittance. But like the other games, now the SK Fnatic, like those were fantastic games, and I think yes. you can manufacture entertainment in a way that's also competitively pure in that case. But there's many people in the industry, including many of the executives at some of the big companies hosting these tournaments, who are just like very, very vocally against anything that closes the door on anybody, regardless of what that does for the entertainment value. And I think at some point there's going to be a choice, and it's going to be imposed on people, if it's not made before, that it has to be about entertainment as opposed to whatever is, quote unquote, right.
This video was kindly supported by Eddie, Kris with a K, Lager15, Pronogo, Shenlong, Zachary Carter, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, Animosity, Dean Tanglis, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks going out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Want to suggest topics or guests for my shows? Want to ask me questions in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Who are the upcoming guests? Maybe you want to be part of one of those discussions I do where we nerd out. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today by using the Patreon link in the description box below.